Make this city affordable for everyone.
Zohran Mamdani says he can build 200,000 affordable homes in New York City over the next decade. Not market-rate apartments with a small percentage set aside for lower incomes. Not mixed-income developments where most units still cost $3,000 a month. He means housing that working-class families, service workers, teachers, and young professionals can actually afford. This is the central promise of his campaign for mayor, and it has made him one of the most talked-about candidates in a race that will determine whether New York remains livable for anyone earning less than six figures. The city is in crisis. Median rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan exceeds $4,500. In Brooklyn, it is over $3,600. Families are being pushed into shelters at record rates. More than 146,000 people are currently in the homeless shelter system, including tens of thousands of children. Eviction filings have surged past pre-pandemic levels. Young people who grew up here are leaving because they cannot afford to stay. Mamdani argues that this is not a natural market outcome but the result of deliberate policy choices that favor real estate developers and wealthy property owners over residents who need housing. His plan is not incremental. He proposes the largest expansion of social housing in modern American history. Social housing, in this context, means publicly owned residential buildings where rents are capped based on income, not market rates. The city would own the land and the buildings. Tenants would pay what they can afford, typically around 30% of their income. The model exists in Vienna, Singapore, and parts of Scandinavia, but it has never been attempted at this scale in the United States. Mamdani frames this as the only realistic solution to a housing market that has failed to provide shelter as a basic necessity. He points to decades of failed policies: tax breaks for luxury developments, zoning laws that restrict density, a reliance on private developers who build only when profits are guaranteed. He says the city has spent billions subsidizing private construction and has little to show for it. The alternative, he argues, is to stop waiting for the market to fix itself. But the question immediately arises: where does the money come from? Building 200,000 units over 10 years would cost tens of billions of dollars. The city budget is already strained. Debt obligations are rising. Infrastructure needs repairs. Schools need funding. Critics say the plan is financially impossible without massive tax increases or cuts to other services. Mamdani insists the funding exists if political priorities change, but he has not yet provided a detailed budget breakdown that accounts for every dollar. And even if the money could be found, there is the question of land. Where, exactly, would these 200,000 homes go? The city owns more land than most people realize. Mamdani's team has identified thousands of underused lots, vacant parcels, and city-owned properties that could be converted into housing. Some are parking lots. Some are empty buildings that have sat unused for years. Some are sites currently leased to private developers at below market rates. The proposal is to reclaim these assets and use them for public housing construction. In addition, Mamdani supports rezoning large portions of the city to allow for taller, denser buildings in neighborhoods that are currently restricted to low-rise construction. This would not only create space for new housing but also challenge some of the most protected residential areas, where zoning laws have preserved exclusivity and kept property values high. Wealthy neighborhoods in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens have historically resisted density increases, arguing that taller buildings would change the character of their communities. Mamdani's position is that character preservation has become a cover for economic segregation. There is also the possibility of acquiring privately owned land through eminent domain or purchasing properties on the open market when they become available. This is where the plan becomes legally and politically complicated. Eminent domain allows the government to take private property for public use, but it requires compensation at fair market value, and it triggers lawsuits that can delay projects for years. Real estate investors and landlords would almost certainly fight any large-scale effort to seize property, even if the city offered payment. Supporters argue that the city has used eminent domain before for infrastructure projects, highways, and stadium construction. They say housing is at least as important as those uses. Opponents argue that forcibly taking property from private owners, even with compensation, sets a dangerous precedent and undermines property rights. They also question whether the city has the legal capacity to move quickly enough to meet Mamdani's timeline. Then there is the construction itself. Building 200,000 units in 10 years means completing roughly 20,000 apartments per year. New York has not achieved that level of production in decades, even with private developers leading the effort. The construction industry is already facing labor shortages, rising material costs, and supply chain delays. Union labor, which Mamdani has pledged to use, costs more than non-union alternatives. Environmental reviews, community board approvals, and design standards all add time to the process. Policy analysts question whether the city's bureaucracy can handle a project of this scale. Permitting delays, contractor disputes, and coordination failures have plagued previous affordable housing initiatives. If construction falls behind schedule, costs escalate. If costs escalate, fewer units get built. If fewer units get built, the entire plan risks becoming another well-intentioned promise that fails to deliver. And if it does succeed, who actually benefits? The target population for Mamdani's housing plan includes low-income families, essential workers, young professionals, and anyone currently priced out of the rental market. Rent would be income-based, meaning a family earning $40,000 per year would pay around $1,000 per month, while a household earning $80,000 might pay $2,000. The goal is to eliminate the rent burden that forces people to spend 50 or 60% of their income on housing. This would directly benefit tens of thousands of service workers, teachers, healthcare aides, restaurant employees, and retail staff who keep the city functioning but cannot afford to live here. It would also provide stability for families who have been cycled through the shelter system or forced into overcrowded apartments. For young people trying to build careers in New York, it could mean the difference between staying and leaving. Supporters argue that affordable housing is not just a social good but an economic necessity. If workers cannot afford to live near their jobs, businesses struggle to hire. If young professionals leave, the city loses talent and tax revenue. If families are displaced, neighborhoods lose cohesion. Mamdani's plan, in this view, is not charity, it is infrastructure that makes the city functional. But critics raise concerns about who gets selected. There are far more people who need affordable housing than there are available units. If 200,000 apartments are built, and there are 1 million people on waiting lists, how does the city decide who moves in? Lotteries have been used in the past, but they create frustration and resentment among those who lose. Income caps can exclude middle-class families who earn too much to qualify but still cannot afford market-rate housing. And if preference is given to current residents, it could disadvantage newcomers and immigrants who are also struggling. There is also the question of neighborhood opposition. Building large-scale housing projects in established communities often triggers resistance from existing residents who worry about overcrowding, school capacity, parking, and traffic. Even progressive neighborhoods that support affordable housing in theory sometimes oppose specific developments in their own areas. Mamdani would need to navigate these local battles while maintaining political momentum. And then there is the economic impact on the broader housing market. If 200,000 affordable units flood the market, what happens to private landlords and property values? Real estate investors and landlords argue that Mamdani's plan would destabilize the housing market and reduce property values across the city. If a significant portion of rental housing becomes publicly owned and rent-controlled, private landlords lose tenants and revenue. Smaller landlords, who own just a few buildings, say they would be forced to sell or go bankrupt. Larger real estate firms warn that new construction would slow dramatically if developers see no profit potential. Some economists argue that increasing housing supply, even if publicly owned, would reduce overall rents by easing demand pressure. If more people can access affordable housing, fewer people compete for market-rate apartments, which could lower prices. This theory assumes that supply and demand function rationally in the housing market, but New York's real estate market does not always follow standard economic models. Investors buy properties as assets, not just for rental income. Foreign capital flows into luxury real estate regardless of local demand. Developers sometimes leave units vacant rather than lower prices. Critics also warn that a large-scale social housing program could increase inflation. If the city borrows heavily to finance construction, that debt must eventually be repaid through taxes or budget cuts. If property taxes rise to fund the program, landlords may pass those costs on to tenants in non-rent stabilized units. If the city cuts services to fund housing, residents lose access to education, sanitation, or public safety programs. There is also the risk of unintended consequences. If affordable housing is concentrated in certain neighborhoods, it could create new patterns of segregation. If income limits are set too low, middle-class families remain excluded. If maintenance and management are underfunded, buildings deteriorate into the kind of neglected public housing projects that failed in the 1970s and 1980s. Mamdani acknowledges these concerns but argues that doing nothing is more expensive. The city currently spends billions on homeless shelters, emergency housing vouchers, and subsidies for private developers. He claims that redirecting those funds into social housing would be more efficient and more humane. But the transition from the current system to a new one would take years, and during that period, costs would overlap. The city would still need to operate shelters while simultaneously building new housing. It would still need to fulfill existing contracts with private developers while shifting priorities toward public construction. Financially, the plan requires sustained political will over multiple administrations. If a future mayor or city council decides to abandon or underfund the program, the entire effort could collapse, leaving incomplete buildings and wasted investment. And even if everything goes according to plan, there is the question of whether New York City's government is capable of managing this much housing. New York City's track record with large-scale public housing is mixed. The New York City Housing Authority, which manages public housing developments, has faced decades of mismanagement, underfunding, and neglect. Buildings have fallen into disrepair. Heating systems fail in winter. Mold and lead paint remain unaddressed. Residents have filed lawsuits against the city for failing to maintain safe living conditions. The federal government has placed NYCHA under oversight due to its failures. Mamdani's plan is not to expand NYCHA but to create a new entity, a public developer with different management structures, better funding, and stronger accountability. He has cited Vienna's model, where social housing is professionally managed, well-maintained, and occupied by a broad mix of income levels. Vienna invests heavily in upkeep and treats social housing as a long-term public asset, not a temporary safety net. But Vienna's system developed over a century with consistent political support and stable funding. New York would be starting from scratch in a polarized political environment where administrations change every 4 years. If the program succeeds, future mayors will take credit. If it fails, they will blame the previous administration. This creates incentives for short-term thinking rather than long-term investment. There is also the question of tenant rights and management disputes. If the city owns hundreds of thousands of apartments, it becomes one of the largest landlords in the country. How would it handle evictions? How would it resolve conflicts between tenants? How would it maintain quality standards across such a large portfolio? Private landlords are subject to housing court and tenant protection laws, but what happens when the government is the landlord? Does the city have the legal and administrative capacity to manage that relationship fairly? Supporters argue that public ownership gives tenants more power, not less. If housing is a public good, residents can organize politically to demand better conditions. They can vote for representatives who prioritize maintenance and investment. They can hold the city accountable in ways they cannot hold private landlords accountable. Critics argue that government bureaucracy is slow, inefficient, and unresponsive. They point to the DMV, the MTA, and NYCHA as examples of public agencies that fail to deliver quality service. They say that no matter how well-intentioned the plan is, it will eventually become another bloated, dysfunctional government program. And beyond management, there is the question of political sustainability. Can Mamdani actually win, and if he does, can he build the coalition necessary to pass this plan through the city council, the state legislature, and the courts? Mamdani is running as a democratic socialist in a city where real estate interests have enormous political influence. Developers, landlords, and financial firms contribute heavily to political campaigns. They fund lobbying efforts. They shape media narratives. They have access to power in ways that tenant organizers and housing advocates do not. If Mamdani wins, he would face immediate opposition from real estate industry groups, business coalitions, and fiscal conservatives who argue that his plan is financially reckless. He would need support from the city council, where members represent districts with varying levels of enthusiasm for large-scale public housing. Some council members represent neighborhoods that desperately need affordable housing. Others represent areas where homeowners and landlords form the political base. He would also need cooperation from the state government. New York City cannot raise certain taxes or change certain regulations without approval from Albany. The governor and state legislature have significant control over city policies, and they are influenced by their own political calculations. If state leaders see Mamdani's plan as politically risky or economically disruptive, they could block key elements of it. Then there is the legal challenge. Real estate firms would almost certainly sue to stop large-scale eminent domain actions or rezoning efforts. These lawsuits could delay construction for years. Even if the city wins in court, the time lost could derail the entire project. And if the city loses, it would be forced to negotiate compromises that weaken the plan. Supporters believe that public pressure can overcome institutional resistance. They point to movements in other cities where tenant organizing, rent strikes, and grassroots campaigns have forced policy changes. They argue that if enough people mobilize, politicians will have no choice but to act. But New York has seen bold housing proposals before, and most of them have been watered down or abandoned. Bloomberg promised thousands of affordable units and delivered far fewer. De Blasio pledged 300,000 affordable homes and fell short. Eric Adams campaigned on housing but has faced criticism for prioritizing luxury development. Political promises do not always translate into tangible results. And even if Mamdani's plan moves forward, there is no guarantee it will work as intended. What if construction costs exceed projections? What if tenants refuse to move into public housing because of stigma? What if private developers stop building entirely, worsening the overall housing shortage? What if the city borrows too much and triggers a fiscal crisis? These are not hypothetical concerns. They are risks that city officials, policy analysts, and economists have raised repeatedly. And they are questions that Mamdani has not fully answered. The debate over Mamdani's housing plan is not just about policy. It is about what kind of city New York wants to be. Is housing a commodity, subject to market forces, or a right that the government must guarantee? Should the city prioritize private investment and economic growth, or should it intervene directly to ensure that ordinary people can afford to live here? Can a city that has been shaped by real estate speculation and luxury development change course, or is it too late? Supporters see Mamdani's plan as the only serious attempt to address a crisis that worsens every year. They argue that incremental reforms have failed, that private developers will never build enough affordable housing, and that bold action is necessary. They believe that if New York does not act now, it will become a city only for the wealthy, a place where working people exist only as a service class commuting in from distant suburbs. Opponents see the plan as ideologically driven and economically dangerous. They argue that the city does not have the resources, the competence, or the political stability to manage such a massive public housing program. They worry that it will drive out investment, increase taxes, and ultimately make the housing crisis worse, not better. They believe that the solution lies in reducing regulations, encouraging private development, and allowing the market to function. Both sides claim to care about affordability. Both sides claim to want a city where people can live with dignity. But they disagree fundamentally on how to achieve that goal. What remains unclear is whether Mamdani's plan is a realistic blueprint for change or an aspirational vision that will collapse under its own ambitions. Whether the city has the capacity to build and manage 200,000 homes without repeating past failures. Whether voters will support a candidate who promises something so radically different from the politics they're used to. And whether, even if everything goes right, it will be enough to save a city that has been drowning for decades. New York has always been a place where the impossible becomes possible, and where grand plans fail spectacularly. Mamdani's campaign forces the city to decide which version of itself it believes in.